So last week we only met one time. We talked about some biological rationale for criminality. We talked about the Juke family and the Kallikak family. Somebody remind me about the Juke family, or either one. I'll give dealer's choice. Whichever one you want to talk about. To start you off, they were two families that were studied based on how much criminality was in their descendants. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's what we talked about exactly. So we talked about the Juke family first. We said that Mr. Juke, J-U-K-E, is going to come up a lot. Might even see him again on some written material. We said that the patriarch of the Juke family, Mr. Juke, was just kind of a bad dude. A lot of criminal behavior, and there was a study of his descendants, several generations of his descendants, until we got to thousands of his descendants. And there was just an overwhelming amount of criminality in his descendants, just over and over and over. Those folks just couldn't stay out of trouble. And initially, as we look at that, we thought, well, I mean, if he was a bad guy and he passed on those bad guy genes, those criminalistic, criminal type genes, then obviously, and I use the word obviously in a little bit of jest, but obviously he must be passing on criminal genes. If he's a criminal and he's got all his kids and a lot of his kids are criminals and a lot of their kids are criminals, a lot of their kids are criminals, then the way the researchers initially looked at it was, well, this is the most obvious answer. He must be passing on these genes. Because, I mean, what else is there to look at other than the most obvious answer? But then we said something else later on, and we said it over and over that day. The correlation, there was a correlation between his criminal behavior and all his descendants' criminal behavior. There's obviously a correlation. But what we say about correlation?
Correlation doesn't equal causation.
Exactly. Correlation does not always equal causation. Sometimes it does. I mean, if you can prove the causation. But in general, you cannot assume that correlation always is causation. And then we looked at the Kallikak family, Mr. Kallikak, who was not necessarily criminal in nature, but not exactly the nicest guy because he stepped out on his wife. So he had a nice religious wife at home, and he stepped out on her with a barmaid. And the barmaid wasn't all there in the head. She was a little soft-brained, they'd say. She had some mental issues. Well, he stepped out on her and got her pregnant. She had a kid. She had a boy. But then he went back home and eventually he had two sons with his wife as well. So Mr. Kallikak had three boys, one with the barmaid and one with his nice Christian wife who was at home. The son he had with the barmaid could not stay out of trouble, just kept getting arrested over and over and over. And the two sons that he had at home with his nice religious wife staying at home, they were fine. They didn't get in trouble at all. So obviously, and again, I use that term in jest, obviously the barmaid must have passed on these genes because the only thing, the thing they had in common was Mr. Kallikak. He couldn't have passed on any genes because his kids were fine at home with his wife, but the kids that the barmaid had with him, or the kid, just couldn't stay out of trouble. So she must have passed on. She must have had bad criminal genes, and the nice Christian, nice religious wife at home must not have had the criminal genes, right? Is that what, how it was framed in that study, and how we poke some holes in that. Oh, 100%, exactly. Tell me more about the environment, or compare the two environments for me.
Yeah, she had mental issues, so we was motivation better, or if she just stay away, she's already right, she's wrong. They have both parents.
I mean, is there an advantage to having two parents over one? Sure. By no means, I was raised by a single parent. By no means are we saying that you can't be successful with a single parent, but are we saying that you have a head start, like a better chance, better odds if you have two parents? Probably. I was the exception to even, the exception to just a two-parent rule. I was raised by a single father, which is even more rare than a single mother. And for the most part, I turned out okay. So what we're saying is that perhaps it is not genetic. They're not passing down these criminal genes. Maybe what we're developing is some sort of environment that causes criminality. So we talked about the Kallikak. So the Juke family, what kind of environment was that? If they had two parents, maybe we had the Mr. and Mrs. Juke in the beginning, what was passed on to them if it wasn't criminal genetics? Just plain teaching, could be. We don't have the right answer. We don't know 100% because the study was about the assumption of genetics. But if Mr. Juke was just a criminal in nature, and that's how he raised his kids, so that's what they saw was whatever criminal, and I don't even know if we know what kind of criminal behavior he was involved in, but just theorizing if he was into property crimes and stealing, and that's what his three boys saw. And when those three boys grew up, they continued in that criminal behavior. And their boys, that's what they saw. Then maybe it was just a learned behavior more than the idea that, whereas the Kallikaks, it had something to do with a poor upbringing and inability to raise them based on mental illness or environment or the fact that it was a single parent or the fact that she was a barmaid, maybe she wasn't making a lot of money. Like, who knows? There's a ton of factors. So, can we rule out this genetic connection that initially was seen in the Kallikaks and the Jukes? The reason I turned this on is because I want to show a quick video about the Human Genome Project. So as we progress, those are in the 1800s. I believe the Jukes might have been early 1800s, maybe the 1820s, and then the Kallikaks are right around the 1870s, but early and late 1800s, a long time ago, is when we started looking at these genetic connections. A lot has progressed since then. And I told you, a lot of these biological theories of criminology have been debunked for the most part. But let's look at how much we've advanced real briefly in the study of genetics. Oh, bring your laptops Wednesday. Obviously, there's an announcement in a random class that isn't this class. I need to watch this video, so I gotta find it.
Gum. Fancy gum. Icebreakers. Ooh, fancy.
Packed inside every cell in your body is a set of genetic instructions, 3.2 billion base pairs long. Deciphering these directions would be a monumental task, but could offer unprecedented insight about the human body. In 1990, a consortium of 20 international research centers embarked on the world's largest biological collaboration to accomplish this mission. The Human Genome Project proposed to sequence the entire human genome over 15 years with $3 billion of public funds. Then, 7 years before its scheduled completion, a private company called Celera announced that they could accomplish the same goal in just 3 years and at a fraction of the cost. The two camps discussed a joint venture, but talks quickly fell apart as disagreements arose over legal and ethical issues of genetic property, and so the race began. Though both teams used the same technology to sequence the entire human genome, it was their strategies that made all the difference. Their paths diverged in the most critical of steps. The first one. In the Human Genome Project's approach, the genome was first divided into smaller, more manageable chunks, about 150,000 base pairs long, that overlap each other a little bit on both ends. Each of these fragments of DNA was inserted inside a bacterial artificial chromosome, where they were cloned and fingerprinted. The fingerprints showed scientists where the fragments overlapped without knowing the actual sequence. Using the overlapping bits as a guide, the researchers marked each fragment's place in the genome to create a contiguous map, a process that took about 6 years. The cloned fragments were sequenced in labs around the world, following one of the project's 2 major principles, that collaboration on our shared heritage was open to all nations. In each case, the fragments were arbitrarily broken up into smaller overlapping pieces, about 1,000 base pairs long. Then, using a technology called the Sanger method, each piece was sequenced letter by letter. This rigorous map-based approach, called hierarchical shotgun sequencing, minimized the risk of misassembly, a huge hazard of sequencing genomes with many repetitive portions, like the human genome. The consortium's better safe than sorry approach contrasted starkly with Celera's strategy, called whole genome shotgun sequencing. It hinged on skipping the mapping phase entirely, a faster though foolhardy approach according to some. The entire genome was directly chopped up into a giant heap of small overlapping bits. Once these bits were sequenced via the Sanger method, Celera would take the formidable risk of reconstructing the genome using just the overlaps. But perhaps their decision wasn't such a gamble, because guess whose freshly completed map was available online for free? The Human Genome Consortium, in accordance with the project's second major principle, which held that all of the project's data would be shared publicly within 24 hours of collection. So in 1998, scientists around the world were furiously sequencing lines of genetic code using the tried and true yet laborious Sanger method. Finally, after 3 exhausting years of continuous sequencing and assembly, the verdict was in. In February 2001, both groups simultaneously published working drafts of more than 90% of the human genome, several years ahead of the consortium's schedule. The race ended in a tie. The Human Genome Project's practice of immediately sharing its data was an unusual one. It is more typical for scientists to closely guard their data until they are able to analyze it and publish their conclusions. Instead, the Human Genome Project accelerated the pace of research and created an international collaboration on an unprecedented scale. Since then, robust investment in both the public and private sector has led to the identification of many disease-related genes and remarkable advances in sequencing technology. Today, a person's genome can be sequenced in just a few days. However, reading the genome is only the first step. We're a long way away from understanding what most of our genes do and how they are controlled. Those are some of the challenges for the next generation of ambitious research engineers.
Grammarly is your personal writing assistant for clear emails.
So there's been some crazy advances in genetic research. That video shows a couple of good examples, lessons learned. One, we can learn that now we have a map, a genetic map. We can see what some of our genes do, exactly what some of our genes are doing, and we can predict whether or not somebody is more prone to certain behaviors, and specifically more prone to certain diseases. What about those diseases? If we can do genetic predictions, it kind of brings up some ethical dilemmas. If you're about to have a child and you know that child is prone to a very painful disease, a debilitating disease that you're going to end up having to take care of them for the rest of their life. Your child will never leave your home and they'll be in pain for the rest of their life. Do you allow that child to be born and live that life, and you and your partner live that life, or not? Those are ethical dilemmas that are brought up whenever we are able to predict via genetics. What about criminality? Let's talk about connections, genetic connections to criminality. We said that we weren't handing down, the Kallikaks and the Jukes were not handing down their criminal DNA. We're in chapter 5 today, by the way. So we said that the Jukes and the Kallikaks were not handing down their criminal DNA. We also said, we talked last week a little bit about, we know that males are arrested far, far more often than females. We had a little bit of a discussion on that, discussion of where were males caught more often than females, or males engaged in criminal behavior more often. We didn't really come up with as far as I remember, we didn't really come up with a rationale or a decision. Male and female chromosomes. In general, this is how they're built. Which is which? What's XX?
Female.
Female. Which leaves one option. Female, male. Two guys, Ropers and Bronner, started doing studies of genetics and criminality. They started realizing that perhaps females were engaged in less criminal behavior because they had two X chromosomes. The X chromosome being less inclined to engage in criminal behavior, and because the male only had one X chromosome, it had twice as much chance as for one chromosome to go bad. That was their working theory. They also realized that there was a gene, part of that DNA structure, that caused different chemicals in the brain to be released at different rates. Serotonin was one of those. And when those chemicals, especially serotonin, were released at a different rate than other people, because of the specific gene that went bad, then those people were more prone to engage in criminal behavior. So it kind of made it seem like the Jukes and the Kallikaks may have been passing down some sort of gene, some sort of criminal gene. We talk about sequencing, a lot of it has to do with letters, genetic sequencing. So there was one series of folks that had one genetic commonality, the DRD2. And those folks tended to just engage in more thrill-seeking behavior. They were more prone to do dangerous activities. Doesn't necessarily mean it's criminal behavior. I mean, dangerous activities could be riding bikes downhill, dirt biking downhill, or skydiving, or any series of dangerous behaviors. But can those types of thrill-seeking behaviors also go hand in hand with criminality? If you get a thrill from one, can you get a thrill from another? We talked, yeah, exactly. We talked about how some people only engage in crime because of the, for lack of a better word, the fun of the crime. Not necessarily breaking into cars because they want, they need a laptop. Breaking into cars because the thrill of not getting caught is there. So dopamine is what's released and causes that pleasure when folks engage in these activities. And serotonin, when we talked about that, how it was being regulated or not regulated, kind of cancels that out. So if you've got a specific gene, a mutation to this gene that doesn't necessarily produce as much serotonin to tone you down, to calm you down and say, hey, start acting right, and you still have all that dopamine that you're looking for, but not the serotonin that would calm you down, what's our natural biological reaction? Right, you're gonna be aggressive and seeking those pleasures and whatnot without the control of the serotonin. So how does that play into our theory of the Jukes and the Kallikaks? I mean, before we said obviously it was genetic, and then we said there was no, or correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation. But now we're seeing that there are specific genetic sequences that will cause somebody to be more aggressive and cause somebody to be more thrill-seeking. What are our thoughts now on how criminality can be affected by genetics, by this sequence? Can somebody with this sequence be more prone to criminal behavior? We'll just talk about this one. Somebody who's a thrill seeker, doesn't have the releasing of serotonin to tamper the seeking of dopamine. Can that person specifically be more prone to criminality? Could be, sure. And is that based on, remember we talked about nature versus nurture, is that based on their upbringing or is that based on their biology? Yeah. Like in this, so far what we talked about, we haven't talked anything about nurture, 100% nature. So now we're we started out talking biological causes, and then we said not necessarily biological causes, and now it seems like we're kind of going back to that biological, maybe there is. But who do you, I can't think of a better word, who do you believe more? Those who researched the Kallikaks and the Jukes back in the 1800s? Or those who actually were able to use the mapping of genetic or genomes and actually know exactly what gene is causing it, as opposed to saying this unknown criminal behavior gene, which is more of a believable study? Sure, I mean, if you're able to actually point out exactly which gene it is, it's going to be a little more credible, right? But what if they both cause it? We said nature versus nurture and nature, but maybe it's nature and nurture. Gene interaction, gene environment interaction is something you read about in the book. Gene environment interaction. What if there's genes that don't necessarily, like this one is just automatically not going to produce as much serotonin. Just that's how it's going to be. But what if not producing enough serotonin doesn't necessarily cause criminal behavior? What if there's genetic predispositions for criminal behavior, but we need to add something to it, add an environment to it? those chemicals, this is one of them. No, it's NaO-A. So having that chemical in your body can sometimes calm you down. I just want to find a good example. So having this genetic sequence here, there's a lot of children, when they study children, this is in New Zealand, when they study children, they realize that a lot of children with this sequence were predisposed to violent behavior, just bad kids. You know, sometimes it's hard for kids to be engaged in criminal behavior, but just, you know, you can tell when kids are not acting right. But there was additional factors to that. Not every kid with this sequence had criminal behavior, but almost every kid that had this sequence and malnutrition ended up being criminal behavior. Not every kid who had malnutrition engaged in criminal behavior. Not every kid who had this genetic sequence had criminal behavior. But if you had this gene and malnutrition was introduced into you through no fault of your own, you know, kids aren't in charge of how much they have to eat, if they're malnourished or not. But once you add malnourishment to that sequence, suddenly the vast majority of children engage in criminal or aggressive behavior. So that's what we're talking about when we say gene environment connection. So there's a correlation there. What kind of, I mean, take it back to the Jukes. Is there a chance that maybe, you know, as we had those descendants, they pass down a gene like this? Is there a chance, what types of environments would cause malnutrition back in the 1820s? In general, would a petty criminal like Mr. Juke be rich enough to feed his family very well? Probably not. I mean, that's a maybe. They were predisposed to that criminal behavior, and then you introduce another factor to that. There's another gene called the clock gene. They studied it in mice. They would introduce mice to cocaine. Not every mouse would end up addicted to cocaine. But every mouse that had the clock gene, almost every mouse that had the clock gene, the vast majority of mice that had the clock gene, just like clock, would become addicted. So when we talk about having an addictive personality, or doesn't necessarily have, doesn't have to be cocaine. What other behaviors can somebody become addicted to?
Alcohol.
Alcohol, yeah, it's not. Food, absolutely. Overeating. I do horrible with portion control. Gambling, shopping, just pretty much, I guess, any negative behavior you could become addicted to, because you're going to find some sort of pleasure. I mean, we talked about criminal behavior being, some folks seek criminal behavior because of the pleasure. And we talked about the rational choice theory, pain versus pleasure, right? You're going to seek whatever is the most pleasurable, and sometimes you're going to forego what other people would consider a good decision because you're making that choice. So if these mice, did they start out addicted to cocaine? No, I mean, you had to have something introduced to them. Had these mice who had the clock gene gone the whole life without ever being introduced to cocaine, would they be fine?
Yeah.
In general, I mean, outside of any other introductions that we don't know about, maybe, I mean, just because they had the clock gene, they may have had some other gene that would have caused something. But looking at that one gene, had that never been introduced to them, and we look at humans, some folks can engage in narcotics use once, twice, recreationally, no problem at all. Some folks do it one time and they're addicted. Why do you think that is? Why can some folks keep doing it whenever they want, stop whenever they want, recreationally use cocaine, heroin, whatever, and others become addicted quickly or just become addicted at all?
Different genetic receptors.
Right. So they're genetically predisposed to addictive behavior. Do you think the clock gene was specific to cocaine, or do you think it was addictive behaviors in general? It's not in the study, but I want to hear your thoughts. Yeah. If somehow, I mean, I realize we can't really introduce mice to shopping or chocolate or food. Well, food we can. Do you think if we had been able to change that or make our own study and introduce another gambling option, whatever it is, and we saw that clock gene, do you think that those mice would have just as easily been addicted to those behaviors? I think so too. I mean, like I said, it's not in the study, and we can't prove it. But I think addictive behavior is addictive behavior, whether or not they introduce it to cocaine, heroin, shopping. Then why do you think we have drugs of choice? Why are some people addicted to cocaine, some people addicted to heroin, and some people addicted to meth? I'm sorry? Could be. Maybe it hits the gene a little different, or maybe it's just the same reason that I like root beer and you like Dr. Pepper and you like Pepsi. That doesn't mean we're addicted. We just have different desires, different likes, if you will. Maybe it comes from functionality. Heroin, you're not going to get a lot of work done on heroin, whereas cocaine and meth are a little bit more of an upper than a downer. So it's going to keep you awake, and maybe it comes from just the necessity or the desire for the reaction to the drug. Heroin's going to, for one, put you to sleep. Also, heroin's an offshoot, it's an opioid, so an offshoot of painkillers. So if somebody starts out on painkillers, opioids, and then progresses to heroin, not necessarily because they like to sleep or being on the nod, but it progressed from a need, a pain need. There was no meth need, there's no cocaine need. It was still an addictive behavior. So some of the dangers of getting addicted to pain narcotics or having a lot of pain narcotics prescribed as a treatment option, you'll see sometimes folks will progress from one opioid to another based on the inability to continue that treatment. So with folks that continue studying that, another formula. So as it is now, we've gone back and forth so many times that we're not sure as a class where we stand, I would say. We started out with not knowing, and then the Kallikaks and the Jukes saying, okay, well, it's definitely, they're handing something down. And then the more we studied, said, well, maybe not handing something down, it's environment. And then now we're talking about maybe it's environment and genetics. So currently where we stand is that there's a combination. GXE, G times E, G by E, all those. Genetics combined with environment right now. So if you see that formula again, that's what it means. Genetics combined with environment. So what's the difference between the example we used about the kids? I erased it. The kids who had a predisposition, had a specific gene sequence, a genetic sequence, and there was malnutrition, malnourishment introduced, versus the rats, the mice, or the people where a narcotic an addictive behavior was introduced. What's the most obvious difference between those two?
One's in a real life situation, one's in a lab.
Sure. If we can take the lab out of it, if we take the mice out of it, just the people. So if we know there are people that have addictive behaviors, and eventually a narcotic is introduced or a gambling behavior is introduced or some whatever it is they're going to be addicted to, and then we have the children also in real life who had that predisposition for criminality, and then malnourishment was introduced. Whose decision was it to introduce the malnutrition versus the addictive behavior?
Not the kids.
Right. So sometimes there's a combination of where you've got a gene, and if something is introduced to that gene, then we come up with a behavior or a change in behavior, more prone to criminalistic behavior. But other times we have a behavior where some folks can just keep using cocaine and then stop whenever they want, and other folks do cocaine and become addicted. Those folks, we said, have that genetic predisposition. So you did the cocaine, and then if you have the gene, then you have that criminal behavior. Whereas the other, you had that gene and something was introduced. So another word I want you to remember, epigenetics. We have genetics, EPI, epigenetics. That's our difference between those two types of behavior. So biological isn't always, introducing chemicals or some sort of genetic predisposition. Sometimes we can create it, not on purpose. What about brain injuries? TBI, have you heard of TBI, tried brain injury? Anybody tell me about that? What is that?
Where they had so many brain injuries that it causes depression and depressive moods and all that stuff.
Or it can, right?
Yeah, they can't really be diagnosed with it unless you get a whole bunch of tests. And usually they find out you have it when you get autopsy done.
So it is difficult to do brain exams given our current technology, but we can do PET scans of the brain. And what we found thus far, either through autopsies or even just current, they did a test. There was a study of 22 murder suspects, murder and attempt murder suspects. Can we agree that murder suspects in general are probably more aggressive than most folks? So we already have somebody who we know is aggressive. And we can find a commonality in those folks, then we can say there's at least a correlation between whatever we find and aggressive behavior, violent behavior, murderous behavior. And what they found was that there was damage to the prefrontal cortex of the brain. And all these, that was the commonality in this aggression. Now, sometimes you can be born with just a brain that's not fully developed. It's the same way you can be born with an arm or a hand or a foot or a tongue that isn't fully developed. Sometimes entire bodies are not fully developed. You can have twins that one twin lives and the other twin doesn't. But that damage, that deficiency in the prefrontal cortex of the brain was the commonality of aggressive behavior. So if you can be born with it, how else can you get it? How else can you damage the prefrontal cortex or damage the brain at all?
Contact.
I'm sorry?
Contact.
Yeah, solid contact, explosion. Any type of trauma to the brain can cause damage, can cause injury to the brain, just like any other part of the body. So what do we do with this knowledge? Well, if just like all the others, there's commonality, right? It doesn't mean that one causes the other causes the first. So damage to the brain, is it always going to cause violent behavior?
Not always.
Is violent behavior always going to come from damage to the brain? But if we find that connection, in this case, it's not genetic, but we have a cause plus environment. You start realizing, okay, there's aggressive behavior and it's a cause. Let's talk about the ethics of that. What do you do? Is it ethical to pay attention to every? We'll back up before the traumatic brain injury. If you have a child who's born and you're able to recognize that they have damage or a deficient prefrontal cortex, what should you do with that child? Should you start putting controls on that child? Should you start watching that child? Should we have some sort of agency, child services, to keep a closer eye on something like that? Why not?
I mean, just because the thing's head's messed up doesn't necessarily mean that it's gonna grow up to be, a problem child. He might just have, learning disabilities or something like that. If there is some mess up in the brain, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's gonna be a bad person.
If we did do that, if we could create an agency that did watch every single person that was prone to criminal behavior based solely on that factor, would we, in theory, reduce crime? No, why?
It'd be hard to monitor that through growth.
So just logistics of it would be difficult. What about those folks that we already knew had that? If you could do DNA tests, you do genetic testing, 23andMe and all that. What if you find everybody as soon as they're born and you know exactly who is predisposed to addictive behavior? Should we tell them?
Because then they're gonna be worried the whole time. And they might be like, oh, well, let me prove it, let me try it, and be like, hey, I'm not addicted, then it's up being addicted. Or some excuse for the action.
Or an excuse? So tell me more about that.
Well, when you tell somebody that, like, you have a genetic problem with what they're doing, like, what, they probably would do it, but, like, I have a genetic problem, so you can't really do it.
It's not my fault. I can't help it. How does that translate to telling somebody that their neighborhood is predisposed to more criminal? Are certain neighborhoods in society, do they have higher crime rates than others? I think we can all agree to that. Regardless of the cause, there are certain neighborhoods where folk grew up that is more prone to criminal behavior than other neighborhoods. What if you start telling those people that neighborhood is predisposed to criminal behavior as they're growing up? How do you think that's going to affect their that excuse that they were talking about? What do you think? Do you think it would give them an excuse for criminal behavior based on their environment, regardless of genetics or brain damage or anything, just merely being in an area? So is there a danger in advertising these crime rates then? Is there a danger of excuses? Should we keep crime rate? I mean, how do we reduce those excuses then? I mean, people deserve to know if they're in a high crime rate or not. You think it comes back to what we talked about before, free will? Regardless of what you know, everybody has a free will to make excuses. Whether it's genetic excuses, TBI excuses, addictive behavior excuses, or even just neighborhood environmental excuses. If you're going to be predisposed to making excuses, maybe that's going to happen anyway. But it's the interesting thing you bring up about one of the reasons that the three of you bring up about the reasons why we shouldn't necessarily act on this genetic knowledge. It kind of makes it, really introduces a lot of ethical dilemmas in knowing genetic sequences and knowing that people are predisposed. We talked about being predisposed to diseases. And if you knew somebody's predisposed to, I mean, what if we came up with a crime gene? Even more so than aggressive behavior or addictive personalities. You know, this person, if we're able to eventually continue our mapping and say, this person has a violent gene and they're absolutely predisposed to violence. For the most part, what we've seen is that there has to be, if they're predisposed to violence, they've got that gene for violence, why can't we act on that? We still haven't combined that environment, right? Because you've got to have that combination in this theory. You've got to have that combination of genetics plus environment. Should we be able to control their environment? If we know that malnutrition in those kids that had that MAOA gene, should we pay more attention to those kids and make sure they get fed well? As a society, can we contribute to them socially more? Is it even feasible? How can we do that? If we knew that these are the kids who are predisposed to violent behavior, if they're malnourished, what can we do? If we're going to build a social services network or safety net for these children or the families of children, what can we do? I'm sorry? Home visits, okay. Like social service home visits. At some point, maybe those home visits are welcomed, right? But I imagine, I've never been a social worker, but I've worked around plenty. A lot of social safety nets are welcomed with open arms. Please help me take care of whatever problem I have. My child has an issue and I need help with that. But not everybody is so welcoming. Sometimes doors get slammed. And now as a society, what's our responsibility? If we know 100% that this kid is going to be predisposed to violent behavior if they are not fed properly, that one gene, MAOA. We know they're not going to be, if they're not fed properly, they will be predisposed to, now we have that combination, they're going to be predisposed to violence. Is that going to hurt us as a society? Is there anything we can do to stop that from happening as a society? We have to protect ourselves as a society, right? As a community, we have to protect ourselves. That's what government does. That's what societies do. What can we do?
They should have not, now that it's malnourished.
Right, and if you start getting doors slammed in your face from the parents, then what? I'm sorry? Those are theoretical options. But in the end, is it fair? I mean, we live in a free society, right? While malnourishment is a crime, it's neglect. Not everybody has the same definitions of how kids should be taken care of. And as long as you're not breaking the law and completely neglecting a child, do parents have the right to slam the door on social services and say, I don't want your help, I got this? Yeah. I say unfortunately, but it comes to this specific situation, unfortunately, I'm in favor of folks being able to slam doors and say, hey, I'm not breaking the law, I'm taking care of my children. You don't get to come in here and check up on me if I've done nothing wrong and my child's fine. I mean, those are liberties that we're founded on. So when it comes to that situation where as a society, we want to protect ourselves from genetic predispositions, that's an ethical dilemma that I think has to be aired on the side of freedom versus on the side of safety. So those other things can be introduced. We said you can have, genetics plus environment can be introduced. Traumatic brain injury can be introduced. What about chemicals being introduced? Outside of drugs, outside of narcotic drugs. What happened? Man, I won't even tell you it. Back in the 70s, they started realizing that lead was really bad for kids. Really bad. Like it made them sick. And then if they had lead introduced to them, not only make them sick, but it kind of messed up some of the wiring in the brain. And eventually what happens when you have wiring in the brain messed up? In our world, criminality, right? Like, messed up wiring can lead to criminality. So I started realizing that a lot of kids who were introduced to lead from paint or toys, things like that, they were growing up and having these criminal tendencies. So, '70s, '80s, '90s. I'll do a little timeline here. Call it 2000s. So when do you think, in general, somebody's going to develop criminal behavior? When do you think it starts peaking? Like what age? Teenage? 18? 20? Because that's when you start. Why? Why don't we see a lot of rampant crime when you're 11? I'm sorry?
I said, is it because of juvenile, like adults, it's more broadcast because they're juvenile, they try to get more help before they.
Sure. So we engage in more rehabilitative behaviors or rehabilitative efforts with juveniles. But let's think about what it takes to commit a crime. Why don't we have a lot of 11-year-old bank robberies?
They don't have a car. They don't have a
Car. They may not have the network, the friend network to pull it off. Freedoms. You leave the house, you leave school, somebody's going to make a phone call. Whereas if you don't have a job, nobody's going to make a phone call. Or if you just go to the bank or you go downtown, I can go, after this class, I can go downtown to the bank and nobody's going to ask a question. I have freedom. I have the ability as an adult, the freedom as an adult to engage in crime a little more easily than a juvenile. And that's why, in general, you start seeing that spike in criminal behavior or criminal tendency. Maybe they had the tendency before, but not the ability. So right around 18, 25, when you're young enough and impulsive enough to be able to commit those crimes, and then you start developing the abilities, the tools to commit those crimes. So if they started getting rid of, this is 75. 75, 78, they started getting rid of the lead paints. Where do you think that we started seeing a drop in crime in society?
When they stopped with the lead, I forgot what the year was. 78?
Yeah, right, 75, 78. We started seeing a drop in adult crime as soon as they got rid of the lead.
Probably early 90s. Oh, yeah. And not.
Why? Why you guys both agreed? So why are we here?
Well, you said there was a correlation between lead and criminal behavior.
Right.
Well, it probably wouldn't have an immediate impact.
Tell me why.
I mean, it's got to filter through those as the kids are growing up.
You guys are both, you guys are getting there. I was gonna make you have a dance off to answer.
You win.
Yeah, exactly. So if they stopped putting lead in paint in 75, all the 18-year-olds, they've been having lead for 18 years, right? So in 76, are we gonna still have crime? Because the 1-year-olds aren't gonna be the ones who are committing crime, right? So over here someplace, like you said, here, we're gonna start seeing a reduction in crime as it filters through. And we did. We still had crime in the 80s. High crime. We had the crack epidemic. We had what some politicians call super predators. We had rampant gangs. But then we started seeing a drop. And they said, part of that could have been, there's a correlation. I don't have a study to show that lead was a cause, the reduction of lead was a causation, but there was definitely a correlation there. Let me look up Roe v. Wade. Tell me what year that was, please. Roe v. Wade. And while they're looking at it, tell me what Roe v. Wade is. R-O v. Wade. Anybody know what that court case involved?
It was the abortions court case.
Yeah. So in general, without getting too into detail, it made it a state's decision for.
The decision was in January '73.
January 7th. Okay. So it made it essentially, for lack of a better term, it legalized abortion. So 73, right? 73. 73. Let's break down unwanted pregnancy. In general, folks that elect to terminate a pregnancy, are they electing to terminate pregnancies of children that they want? In general. I think that's fairly simple. If it was a child you want, you wouldn't terminate the pregnancy. So can we extrapolate from that the vast majority of children that are aborted, or fetuses that are aborted, are of children that are not necessarily desired or wanted? Yeah, either can't be cared for, maybe there's a medical issue. We talked about genetics and what was the term we used if we start creating our own genetic lines, if we know what's going on with the genetic, the genome, if we know there's going to be, if a certain genetic offspring is going, or certain offspring are going to carry this negative gene, and so we start developing a way to negate that gene through the lines. Remember what we called that?
Epigenetics.
Yeah, eugenics, yeah. Definitely some ethical issues there, right? If we know, hey, no matter what it is, a disease gene or a criminal gene, if we know, hey, this person's carrying a gene and they're having a child, either we can sterilize that person, make sure that gene doesn't get handed down, or we can terminate pregnancies of people that are handing down that gene. Are there some ethical issues there? Yeah. We don't do that, but that's what it's called. So if we agree that terminated pregnancies in general are pregnancies that were undesired, not wanted, what about if those pregnancies were forced to occur? What are the tendencies or the likelihoods compared to children that are desired, a planned family versus an unplanned pregnancy and an undesired child that's forced to be born? What are the nature versus or what are the nurture consequences in there? What generalities can we make?
Parents are going to look down upon those kids and not want to help them.
So the desired, the planned families, can we generically say that they are going to have a better upbringing in general, a more healthy environment in general? There's always exceptions, of course. Sometimes a two-parent home as opposed to a single-parent home. We said there's exceptions. I came from a single-parent home, but in general, a child who is planned versus or wanted versus a pregnancy that's unwanted is going to result in a better environment for that eventual child. Is that can we stipulate to that in general? So we already said that environment has a big cause, regardless of genetics. Environment has a big cause on success of a child and then eventual criminality of that child, right? So if you have a bad environment, are you more prone to criminality than if you have a good environment?
Yes.
Right. Can a good environment produce a criminal?
Yes.
Yes. And can a bad environment produce a Nobel Prize winner?
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. But in general, are you more prone in a bad environment for criminality than a good environment?
Yes.
Yes. So if we already decided that bad environments make you more prone to criminal behavior than good environments, and we also decided that if wanted planned families versus unwanted children are going to also produce those similar results. If in 1973, Roe v. Wade made access to abortion more available, and crime started going down in the mid-90s, right around here, what can be extrapolated from that? What correlation can we make? Not causation. I'm sorry? It definitely decreased in the mid-90s. If Roe v. Wade made abortion more available here 20 years before this, and we say that criminal behavior it peaks about 20 years of age, what is the correlation between Roe v. Wade and the drop in crime?
So the abortions went up. The number of abortions went up.
So the kids that weren't wanted were not able to be born, so therefore those kids that could potentially be in a bad environment or a bad household, those kids wouldn't be born, so then the crime would go down.
Exactly. Now, this is not a, there's a correlation, but not a causation, because we don't have a study to say that. But some researchers have said, and if you read a book called Freakonomics, they discuss this theory. To me, it's just that. I will present theories to you, regardless of whether or not it's true or proven. It's an interesting correlation. But just like that, just because it's a correlation, what does it mean? What does it not mean?
It doesn't mean causation.
Absolutely doesn't mean that abortion had one thing to do with the crime going down. But some researchers have said maybe, but other researchers maybe had nothing to do with Roe v. Wade. Maybe it had everything to do with the lead. Maybe it was a combination. You just don't know. And that's what, as researchers, as criminalists, we want to look at all the options and see. Any questions today?